This is very, very interesting. This whole thing is very new. But first, Shehecheyanu. This is really, it's the first time that I'm teaching a class in person since March of 2020. And it's wonderful. Claire, you can grab a chumash as you're coming in. So just to explain how this works for those who are coming in. So we are going to make sure everybody is muted in the Zoom room. Thank you, Rachel Feldman. Rachel is usually in all of my Zoom classes, but she's hiding behind the Shar logo. So if you've been in my Zoom room before, you've met Rachel, you just don't know it. But Rachel Feldman, my right-hand woman in so many ways, and the communications and program coordinator at the Shar. I can't remember my own title. And so if I'm I'm asking Rachel to help us out, she's here, she's right here. If you say hi, then the owl.
Hello, everybody.
Let's see if the owl works.
Hi.
There we go. It's so smart. So the other thing that we're using this technology called the owl. It actually looks like an owl from where I'm looking at it. This little, it looks like a speaker right here in the middle of the table, but it's actually a camera that senses who is talking. So if you say something and you say it loud enough, the owl will hear you. And then you see how it splits the screen between me and whoever else was just recently talking. So that means the people on Zoom can see more than just me. They can see people around the room when they ask a question or give a comment. What I haven't yet really figured out is how to make sure we can include our Zoom room to chime in for questions or comments. So I think what we'll do is once in a while, every few commentaries or every few minutes, I'll just pause and I'll say, does anyone on the Zoom want to offer a question or a comment, to make sure that, because otherwise I think it's hard to be mute, unmute. So at that point, I'll say, now's a moment to unmute. And we'll see if anyone out there in Zoom land has something to say. Okay, shall we?
We shall.
We shall. So what I'm hoping we'll do is learn 10 new things about the 10 commandments, maybe even more than 10, but at least 10. And I do have quite a few texts that we're going to be looking at, probably not every word of every one. Esther is starting to see that there's a lot to look at. I'm going to share my screen in a moment, so we'll all be reading it together. But before we do that, let's do a review. So for those of you who would like to look along in our Chumash, if you're in the room, we are in the book of Shemot, chapter 20 of the book of Shemot. So that is on page 406 or 407 if you're looking at the English side. And we're not going to read these 10 commandments inside. We're going to do an executive summary right now. So those of you at home can also be reminded. What is commandment number 1? Anochi, I am the Lord your God. Belief in God. What is commandment number 2? So that's already on the next page. If you're following along in the Chumash, that's page 408. Commandment number 2 was, you should not have any other gods, right? Don't worship idols, don't have other gods besides the one true God. Commandment number 3, that's in verse 7. No, I know I'm zooming through. My goal is not to look at the text right now. It's just a reminder. Commandment number 3, you should not what with God's name? Take God's name in vain. It's
Yes,
not.
but number 2.
Yeah.
You didn't. You say the whole phrase.
Oh, thank you, Philip. You should not have any other gods, and you should not create an image of God.
No, but you should not have any other gods before me.
Oh, lo yihi elecha Elohim acherim al panai. Al panai. So could either mean before me or with me or alongside me.
Yeah.
Yes. That phrase is subject to interpretation, like everything in here. But yes. Are you referring to, what are you specifically trying to get at?
I'm referring to the fact that we can have many gods. Doesn't say you can't have any other gods. You just can't have any gods higher than Hashem.
Okay, would that imply we can believe in other gods?
Well, that's the discussion, which I'll leave to you.
Okay. We may not get to that, but that phrase is ambiguous, and the commentaries have a field day, which that wasn't going to be my field day today. There's so many other things, but thank you. Philip, always keeping me on my toes. You see how the owl does that? Isn't that cool?
I didn't see.
You see the split screen? So now Esther's there and I'm there. That's
It's
what
amazing.
our friends on Zoom can see. It's amazing.
Oh my God.
Okay. Don't worry, you all look fabulous. Nobody's, don't worry. Okay, so number 1 is God. Number 2 is other gods. Number 3 is don't take God's name in vain. Number 4 is to, that's going to be on page 410, is going to be to keep
The Shabbat.
Shabbat. Number 5 toward the bottom of that page is to honor your parents and your grandparents and your great grandparents. Okay, now we're moving on to number 6, you shall not
Kill.
kill. Number 7, you shall not commit adultery. Number 8, do not
Steal.
steal. Number 9, do not bear false witness against your fellow. And the last one, you shall not
How about you?
covet, be envious, be jealous. Okay, those are the 10. We're going to learn 10 new things if those weren't already new for anybody. And this is where I'm going to share my screen. We're starting at the beginning. The first text is the text of what's called the Seifer HaChinuch, which means the book of education. It was trendy, and I'm sure I've mentioned this in the past, for about 100 years or so. It was trendy for lots of Torah scholars to write what's called a Seifer Mitzvot, a book of commandments, because we all knew that there were 10 commandments. But I'm sorry, I'm getting distracted by my, they have to see that. Okay. And it's fine. It's fine. I'm just going to not look at myself there. We all knew there were 613 commandments, but not everyone agreed about what was on that list of 613. So Sefer HaMitzvot of the Rambam listed these 613, and Sefer Mitzvot of the Ramban listed those 613, or different details.
Yeah, my mother had.
I'm gonna make sure to mute whoever's, thank you. So the Sefer HaChinuch is one such list, and he goes according to the text of the Torah. This was, I believe, 14th century. And the first interesting new insight into the first commandment is simply an observation that it's not phrased as a commandment. It's not phrased as you shall believe in God. How is it phrased? If you're looking at the text, I'm now going back to the beginning of it. So at the bottom of page 406 of your Chumash, the last line is simply, I am the Lord your God. Anochi Hashem Elokecha. So this is understood as a commandment, but it could be that this is a statement that maybe is a prerequisite for all of the other commandments. Just, I'm God. I'm the one telling you all these things. Now look at the text of the Sefer HaChinuch, which I brought for you here. And he does phrase it as a mitzvah, as a commandment. But he notices this phrasing of I am, just I am the Lord. So I'm starting at the top before the underlined spot. Mitzvat ha'amana b'metziut Hashem. I know we have some Hebrew speakers, so I'm trying to toggle between Hebrew and English. To believe that the world has one God that caused all that exists, and that all that is and was and will be forever and ever. Shehimsi kol hanimtza mikocho v'chefzo haya kol ma shehu shehaya sheyiyeh la'adei ad, forever and ever. Everything that is, that exists, or that ever did exist, or that will exist, is from God's power and God's will. Mikocho v'chefzo. In the Hebrew, it's the phrasing is reversed. And that God took us out of Egypt, gave us the Torah, as it says. That's how the commandment is phrased. Not only belief in God, but belief in God and what God did for us. So that there's a progression of God's creation and then God's exodus from Egypt, bringing us out of Egypt, and bringing us to this day. And just notice that the part I underlined is this observation. Its understanding is as if it said, know and believe that there is one God, since the word I indicates existence. So he's saying it's as if God is telling us to believe in God, but really that's not what this text says. The text doesn't say believe in the one God. The text says, I am the Lord your God. It's as if God is implying you should know, you should believe. Ki milat anochi, I'm reading in the underlined, the second part of the underlined in the Hebrew. Milat anochi toreh al hametziut. Just that word I is indicating God's existence. So if anyone asks you about the 10 commandments, you can be a little bit more of a stickler. So I was trying to give them a way. And you can say it's not 10 commandments. And in Hebrew, we don't call it Aseret HaMitzvot, the 10 commandments. We call it Aseret HaDibrot, the 10 utterances, the 10 declarations, the 10 things that God said. That's Sinai. Okay? That's insight number 1 about the first commandment. I'm going to try to do one for each of the first few, and then we're going to sort of speed up at the end. I'll pause for any comments. Naomi. Yeah. Go ahead, Naomi.
He also put us in Egypt.
God put us in Egypt. God took us out of Egypt. Very good.
Plan.
You know what? You can show the screen, Rachel. I'm sorry, because I'm realizing then they can't see the people talking. So you can show the one big box just on the side, speaker view. Yeah, that one. It's fine. I know I said I was getting frustrated by it, but just look at it. It's fine. Okay. God is behind everything, but here God is saying the significant moment is the Exodus bringing you to this place. I'll just pause and ask if anyone on the Zoom wants to say something. Feel free to unmute. Now is a good time before we move forward. Unmute and ask your question or make your comment, or just leave it alone and we'll move on. Okay, Philip in the room. Yes.
Yeah, so this is very, very significant because if it's a mitzvah, then that takes many, many Jews out of the big tent. Because
Jews who don't believe in God.
Believe in God, but we do believe in Judaism, and most important, in the Judaism as a way of life.
So I'm going to take your comment and put it in the context of this commandment. This commandment has 2 parts. I am the Lord your God who took you out of Egypt. Some Jewish people may not feel a connection to God, but may feel a connection to the narrative of the Jewish people, the Exodus from Egypt, everything we've been through as a nation, all the culture. And, you know, I often remind people, Judaism doesn't have a lot to say about theology. It doesn't. It gives you lots of different options of ways to think about what God is, Avinu, Malkeinu, our Father, our King, or the Hasidim wanted to just go out into the woods and pray to God there. The only commandment that really is explicit about God in the Torah is that there is one God. So I often talk to atheist Jews who say, I don't believe in God. And sometimes I push a little and I say, do you believe that there's some source of life or some mystery of science or some mystery of the world that you do believe is beyond anything human beings can imagine? And they might say, oh yes, I believe in spirituality, I just don't believe in God. Or I believe in, the forces of nature that are mysterious. So what I'm trying to say is some people who say they don't believe in God believe in a different God than maybe the one they were taught at Hebrew school. But this doesn't tell you how to believe in God. This just says, I am the Lord your God. There is a God. There is a God. And still, maybe you're right. Some people don't believe even in that. And then they're not Torah Jews. They're still Jews. Okay. So the second commandment gets into, talk about theology. The second commandment, and I'm looking in the Chumash on page 408, if you're here on the book. It not only says you should not have any gods before me, you should not make God into an image that represents God, which is why we don't have a lot of paintings or depictions of anything godly. We have ritual objects maybe, but it also says something about God being a jealous God. So I'll read it out loud for those who aren't looking along, but you should not bow to them or worship them. I am the Lord your God. Elkanah, a jealous God. Poked avon avot al banim al shileshim ve'al ribeim l'sonai. I will visit the sin of the fathers upon the children, up to the third and fourth generations for my enemies. So if someone does a sin, even their grandchildren or great grandchildren then will suffer because of that sin. And then on the other side, but God shows kindness for thousands of generations, those who love me and observe my commandments. So even though there's an acknowledgement, so that was verse 5 and 6, if you're following along here in the book, there's an acknowledgement that says, there's a greater reward for thousands of generations. And punishment only goes for 4 generations. There's still something that maybe doesn't sit right with us. Why should I pay the price of some sin that my parent or grandparent did? We don't believe in God. So this commentary that we're looking at now, the Chizkuni, addresses that head on. So this is an insight into the second commandment. But it's not directly about the commandment. It's about something that is mentioned by the way in this commandment. Poked avon avot. Remembers the sin of the fathers onto the children. Does everyone understand the problem with that? It's a problem. Why should I pay for the sins of somebody else? So I'm looking at Chizkuni. It's source number 2 in our handout. I'm skipping down. Okay, you cannot simply forget the sins of the fathers, even if he delayed the punishment for good reasons. Okay, here, this statement, the underlined part. Oh, I didn't underline it in the Hebrew, I apologize. Elakahi, it's basically where it is in the Hebrew. This statement does not mean that children will be taken to task for their father's sins. So I'm reading on the underlined part. Like, God forbid, we don't believe that. Rather, seeing that the principles of each person is he's not saying rather yet. Seeing that the principle of each person is executed on account of his own sins, not because of the sins of his fathers. We know that everyone pays for their own mistakes. You don't, inherit mistakes from your parents. Rather, it's understood differently. And then you may not be convinced by his argument, but here's how he's trying to save us from that assumption. When a person sins, God is apt to delay punishment, to give the sinner an opportunity to become a penitent, to do teshuvah, and therefore rehabilitate himself. God doesn't want to punish you right away. God's patience may extend beyond the lifetime of the sinner and even the sinner's son and grandson or granddaughter. If during those years, the descendants of the original sinner have not mended their ways, but continue to sin, God has to punish the great grandson for his own sins immediately, so that he will not be viewed as forgetting the original sin. So what this is saying is, God is always going to try and only make you pay for your own sin, but God is also always going to try and delay the consequences. God's going to delay it to the next generation. Let's see if they can redeem their sinning parents. Let's maybe delay it to the 3rd generation, even the 4th generation. But at some point, if that is traveling through the generations, these bad choices, at some point, God's not going to extend anymore. When you get to the 4th, it's like a pattern already. At the 4th generation, God says, forget it. I'm not waiting anymore. I'm going to punish you right away. Not for your grandparents' sin, for yours. You see what he just did? He didn't make anybody pay for anybody else's sin beside themselves, but he showed God's mercy only can extend so far. God wants to be forgiving, but at some point there's going to be a limit. what I find interesting about this is that it does imply that my decisions are going to impact my kids. They're going to become sinners, but they can still mend their ways. They can always mend their ways. You have a question or comment?
Both.
Yeah.
Question is, and we're talking about physical sins done by people, like an act against somebody else. Is
It
that what
doesn't
we're questioning?
specify.
Because I'm asking this,
It's not to
when
sin.
people make the wrong decisions and marry their first cousins, we have
Right?
genetic problems that go down to generations after that. I'm wondering
Yes.
about that.
Yes, we have. So I'll say, we have very practical implications of what it means for kids to pay the price of their parents'
They are.
decisions. Although it's not talking about, marrying one's cousin wasn't considered a sin, wasn't considered incest. But I think about this all the time. My grandfather escaped Poland, came to the United States. That's why I was born there. Someone else's grandfather went to, England. That's why they were born there. I moved to Canada. My kids are growing up here. We're always living with the decisions that our parents have made,
Oh, yeah.
for good or for bad. We're always living with our parents' decisions.
And I'm talking about,
And
God.
you're talking about genetically. I'm
Yeah,
trying to
that's
expand it
right.
beyond that, just to say, even without that, we live with our parents' decisions. And what this is implying is that even the bad decisions we make are going to impact our children, our grandchildren, but it's never without hope. They can always do teshuvah. They can always repent.
yeah, I agree with you.
But what's extending only for 3 or 4 generations is God's compassion. It just totally changed. Well, I don't want to say changed the message, but it's not the simple reading of the text. The
Mhm.
simple reading of the text is God will mete out the punishment from up to great grandparents. So it's there's a question in the room. Oh, thank you. Yes, who had a question in the Zoom?
I did.
Unmute yourself. Go ahead.
Hi. Actually, I waited long enough. You said what I was thinking, but the question that the sins of the fathers, will be visited upon the next generations. It just means that as parents or as role models, you have a responsibility because it will punish the future generations. If you don't
Right.
walk the walk that you talk, your kids learn what they see, not what you say.
Realizing when someone in the Zoom is speaking, it doesn't show up here because you pinned only my video, but I don't know what you would have to do.
But can
Maybe
you hear
the-
what I was saying?
I heard, and I could see it on my own laptop that I'm looking at.
Raquel, why don't you just ask the person to identify themselves by name at least?
You
can
don't
click on the
recognize my
gallery view.
voice?
I think it's Gloria, but I'm not sure.
Yes, yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
there, that's all you have
There
to
we
do.
go.
There we go. There we go. Okay.
Anyway, I just wanted to say that was what resonated with me right away, is that it's not that, God is meting out punishment for 4 generations. It's that what your grandparents, how they conducted their lives affected your parents, which affected
Yeah,
how
so
you
we
are.
could use the word punishment, so we could also just use the word consequences. There are
Yeah.
consequences to every major decision.
But it also, it gives the individual responsibility over their behavior. You have a choice in terms of how you want your kids' lives to go.
Well, sometimes, not always.
Well, you have the power
Well,
to have.
there are certain decisions I've made that certainly affect my children's lives. And then there are certain decisions I wish they would make that they're not going to make, or that
But-
they.
But in the future, when your children do make decisions for themselves, it will be based on their life experience, and you're very primary in their early formation. That's all I was going to say.
All right, I want to move forward now. So we're only on the second commandment out of 10. We're going to move forward to the third commandment. This is more of just an interesting factoid, perhaps. I don't think this is such a deep insight, but understanding what it means when it says you shall not take God's name in vain. It's interesting to read what the rabbis understood to be in vain. What is an oath that is an oath in vain? So there's an understanding that if someone says, I swear by the name of God that blah, blah, blah. But if it was a serious oath, that's a valid thing. However, if someone makes a foolish oath in God's name, that's taking God's name in vain. So look at in text number 3 on the handout. Realizing I didn't do
They're
the
not
copy
numbered.
paste it. I'm gonna do what I always used to do is put it in the chat. Give me a moment on my Zoom. Excuse me for a second. I'm putting the link in the chat for those on the Zoom who might want to click on the Sefaria source sheet directly. Okay. So this is text 3. It says Mishnah. The very bottom of that sheet for those who are on paper. It is numbered, right? A tiny number. Mishnah. So which oath, Ezohi Shivuat Shav, is an oath in vain? What is an oath in vain? It gives some really interesting examples. First of all, it's someone who takes an oath to deny something that's obvious. Amar al ha'amud shel even shehu shel zahav. If you say, for example, something that's made of stone, I swear in God's name it's made of gold. Obviously not. Or this is also very interesting that may or may not apply in today's day and age. But if you say, al ha'ish shehu isha, al ha'isha shehu ish, like something so obvious, like I swear that man is a woman or that woman is a man. I mean, even in, new understandings of gender, someone who says they're a woman, they're a woman. You're not going to say, I swear you're a man. So that's number 1, is something that's obvious. You shouldn't swear the opposite. Another type of oath in vain is someone who takes an oath about something that's impossible. An oath like, if I did not see a camel flying through the air or a snake as the beam of the olive press, like I swear, im lo ra'iti gamal sheporeach ba'avir. It's so great in Hebrew. Poreach ba'avir, flying in the air. Im lo ra'iti nachash kekorat beit habad. So this giant snake, that would be impossible. So don't go swear about things that are impossible. Another, I find this one to be the most interesting. Another oath in vain is saying in the case of one who said to witnesses, come and testify for me, and they give an oath, we will not testify for you. Why is that an oath in vain? Because you're taking an oath to refrain from performing a mitzvah. In other words, if you are asked to testify in court, it is a mitzvah, you are required to be a witness in court. And if you say, I swear in God's name, I will not testify in court, you're swearing against a commandment. It doesn't even make sense to swear against a commandment. It's something you were already commanded to do. The other examples here are a little more clear, such as I swear by an oath not to build a sukkah, not to take a lulav, not to put on tefillin. This is an oath that's in vain because you have a mitzvah to do these things. It doesn't work. It's a nonsense oath. It's like saying I swear that camels are flying or camels are not flying. Does that make sense? Okay, so that's not commandment number 3. You shall not take an oath with God's name in vain. There's lots of different ways. Promising something that is, which obviously is, promising that something is when it obviously isn't, or promising that you're not going to do a mitzvah when obviously you're commanded to do the mitzvah. Is there a comment in the chat?
No, it's your.
Oh, it's my thing.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes, Philip.
So in the current political situation, all people who enunciate alternate facts, as they call them, are contravening the 3rd commandment.
Fake news.
Fake news.
Well, if they're swearing in God's name about it.
No,
It's not the same as lying.
You don't have to swear. You
This
just
is in the
have to make
context
the
of
statement.
an oath, a formal neder or shavuah, which is a formal swearing. So what you're talking about is lying, which is also against the Torah. Midvar sheker tirchak. You should distance yourself from lying. It's just not this commandment. I'm going to say.
So I'm to understand that all of the instances quoted here have to be in the context of making the statement, the affirmation as an oath. and
As
not-
a formal oath.
Okay,
Yes.
and not
To God.
simply making the statement.
Right. Thank you for clarifying. Although fake news is also not in the spirit of the Torah.
Okay, we're
And
talking
so
about the
people-
third commandment.
But it's not in the third commandment. But midvar sheker tirchak, you shall distance yourself from sheker, from lies. Don't go telling lies and spreading rumors. And yeah, we've got that covered as well, the Torah.
I wish a lot of people could.
A lot of people
follow
need that. All right, we're going to move on. Commandment number 4. You shall keep Shabbat. So if you'd like to look in your books and see the whole commandment, it's actually, I did copy paste this onto our sheet. I just remembered. So on the sheet, number 4 here, source 4 is the commandment of keeping Shabbat. And I should, well, I'll bracket that in a second. So it says, Zachor et Yom HaShabbat l'kadsho, remember Shabbat, keep it holy. 6 days you shall do your work. The 7th day is Shabbat, don't do any work. Anyone in your household, your children, your slaves, your cattle, even someone who's staying temporarily with you or as a stranger, because God created the heaven and earth and rested on the 7th day. Okay, so that is the commandment to keep Shabbat. So now insight number 4 in our 10 commandments. Insight number 4, our commandment number 4. So I'm looking at text 5, the Mechilta. This is a midrash. This is my favorite teaching about Shabbat. One of my favorite. I have to be careful when I say my favorite. I think I say my favorite about a lot of things. Sheshet Yamim Ta'avot. So again, if you're on the sheets, it's text number 5, the Mechilta. Part of the commandment is not just to rest, but to work for 6 days. And the question, and work for only 6 days. The Midrash is asking, is it possible for you to do all your work in 6 days? At the end of the week, I don't know about you, but I still have a to-do list. Rachel and I sometimes say, okay, this is a Monday thing. Like, come on, you're never going to be finished. You're literally never finished. Ella, rather, this is the meaning. Shavot, you shall rest, as if all your work is done. Rest as if you finished your work on Friday. Put it out of your minds. Because that's part of Shabbat, is to cultivate that feeling of there's nothing left to do. I remember the song, one of these Shabbos songs I grew up with. It says, throw away your hammer. There's nothing left to do. Go on home and find the gift that's waiting there for you. I think it's Journeys or one of those, A.B. Rotenberg. I can't remember. It's not Canadian. I know it's American. It goes, oh, it's time to say good Shabbos because all your work is done. Your work is never done, but you put it aside. So the challenge of coming into Shabbat, thinking your work is done is just, putting the to-do list aside for after Shabbos. Another way of saying it towards the end of this midrash, rest is variantly, rest from thoughts of work. It's not that your work is finished, but you're not going to think about your work. Isn't that a lovely insight? Something to aspire to.
Rest as if your work is done.
Rest as if your work is
Oh,
done.
boy.
It's challenging. Okay, I'm going to do one more text and then I'll turn to our Zoom room again. Also, I haven't forgotten about you guys. So that was insight number 4. Insight number 5 is just to notice that the commandment to keep Shabbat is written 2 different times in 2 different places, which you may or may not know. So on our sheets, I've now moved to source 6 on our sheets, which is from Deuteronomy, Devarim. Remember, the 10 commandments were given only once, but were recorded in the Torah twice. The first in the book of Shemot in Exodus, and the second time in the book of Devarim. Why a second time? Who was Moses speaking to that time? It was 40 years later.
He was speaking to the people on the bottom of the map.
Well, the first time he was speaking to them in
right.
Shemot.
Yes, right.
40 years later,
They were in Israel.
he was speaking to the next generation.
Yeah, that's right.
40 years later, he's speaking to people who weren't, well, some of them might have been there, they were very young. But remember, by the end of the 40 years in the wilderness,
So they were.
Everyone
closer.
over age 20 had died out. After the sin of the spies, they had died out in the wilderness. So the only people he's talking to the second time around, he's already 120, he's about to pass on. He's talking to anyone who was either under age 20 or not yet born. And he's giving over the 10 commandments. He's not giving it over again. He's telling them, I came to Sinai and I gave those commandments, and here were those commandments. And the second time he says it, there are a couple of changes in the text from Shemot to Devarim, from Exodus to Deuteronomy. And so the most significant change is in the commandment to keep Shabbat. The first time it says God is saying Zachor et Yom HaShabbat l'kadsho, which means you should remember the Sabbath. The second time is here, source 6, which says, what's the first word?
Observe.
Observe, shamor. I know what's bothering me. Can you push that off? Turn it's that air thing off. Just there's an on-off button. Thank you, Rachel. Anyone else can do it too, but you're just right. So shamor, you should observe Shabbat or keep Shabbat. And of course, which one was it? Which one did God say at Sinai? Zachor or shamor? Think about your lechadodi. What do we say?
Shamor v'zachor.
Bedibur.
Echad.
Yes. It's right on the top, Rachel. Do you want me to do it? No? Oh, that's weird. Okay, never mind. It's like an on-off power button. Okay, I'm getting distracted. I'm sorry. Shamor v'zachor b'dibur echad. Shamor v'zachor b'dibur echad. God said both at the same time. How could God say Shamor and Zachor at the same time? God is God. God can say two things at once. So when God commanded us to keep Shabbat, God commanded us in two different ways. Remember Zachor and observe or protect Shamor. And I didn't bring this explanation, but I'll just say verbally, this is, if you're keeping track, this is insight number 5. Shamor and Zachor, two different aspects of Shabbat. The Shamor is the protect, is the things that we don't do, the no, things we don't do on Shabbat. And the Zachor is the yes, is the positives, the way that we remember Shabbat. We remember it and prepare throughout the week. We remember Zachoreyu al Hayayin through reciting Kiddush, through having positive rituals. So it's the no's and the yeses, b'dibur echad, both recited at Sinai, because both of them are integral to keeping Shabbat.
Is that why we say the little prayer? This is the third day of the Shabbat. This is the
Yes,
fourth day of the Shabbat.
it's understood as part of, thank you, Esther. So Esther's question, for those of you who couldn't hear it at home as well, is this connected to something that we say in our daily liturgy every morning, the last thing we do? You see, if you also came to Daily Minyan like Esther does, even on Zoom you can come, then you would know. We say Hayom Yom, what's today? Wednesday, Revi'i b'Shabbat. Today is the 4th day leading toward Shabbat. And then we have a little psalm that was recited in the temple by the Levites. So by saying today is the 2nd day, today is the 3rd day, today is the 4th day, we don't have names of the week in Hebrew, right? We don't have Monday, Tuesday. We have the 4th day, the 5th day, the 6th day, like we're moving toward Shabbat. Hayom Yom Shabbat Kodesh. So one of the understandings of that is that you're supposed to be focused on preparing something for Shabbat, using your best something, if you get a new outfit, wait and wear it on Shabbos. Counting toward Shabbat is part of the positive, remember the Shabbat. Yes, absolutely.
Keep it holy is the main thing.
What's that?
Keeping it holy. that's
Yes,
the main
yes, sanctifying it, making it holy, making it special. So that difference between Shamor and Zachor, insight number 5, maybe it's insight number 6 already, whatever we're up to. But I wanted to push forward one more thing about Shabbat. And now I'm looking at, in the handout, it's text number 7. Text number 7. So if you'll notice, oh, I guess I didn't mention this. Wait, first, text number 6, which is the Deuteronomy version. It talks about keeping Shabbat. It talks about 6 days doing your work and the 7th you shall rest, but it doesn't talk about creation of the world. It gives a different reason. It talks about so that you and your slaves, etc., will have a break. Lema'an yanuach avdecha va'amatcha kamocha. So this is the end of verse 14. take a day off so that your employees, we can use the word slave here, or we can use an updated understanding of what might the significance of this be. Basically, so that your employees have a day off, because if you're working 7 days a week, they're working 7 days a week, and you need a day when you are not their employer. And we are all equal in the eyes of God. V'zacharta, verse 15, you should remember, ki eved hayita be'eretz Mitzrayim, you were slaves in Egypt. So this is a different reason for keeping Shabbat. It doesn't mention creation. I don't know about you, but when I was 7 years old and I learned, why do we keep Shabbat? Because God rested on the seventh day, and we too rest on the seventh day. But 50% of the Torah, text of the 10 Commandments in the Torah, doesn't mention that at all. Look forward to one particular way of understanding this. So now this is the next text 7. The Chizkuni, who was a commentator, a Torah commentator in the 13th century in France. So around the area of Rashi, but 100 years later or so. Why is God mentioning slavery in Egypt? What does this have to do with keeping Shabbat? Look at that, just that underlined line to remind us, don't treat our slaves the way we were treated in Egypt. Don't treat our employees the way we were mistreated when we were employees, maybe. And just, I'm going to keep going there. In the Hebrew, I'm at the word aval. And in the English, just after the underlined portion, I'm just going to read from there and on. So the mention of slavery in Egypt is to remind us that we were slaves and we shouldn't mistreat our slaves. Aval b'dibrot harishonot, but the first version of the 10 Commandments didn't include this, right? This reference talked about creation of the world, didn't talk about Egypt. Lo peresh hata'am, didn't give this reason. Why? So the implication here is why? Shelo ratza lahazkir et genutam b'simchatam. God didn't want to mention this terrible time at a moment of joy. Did not want to dampen our sense of joy by reminding us our terrible status in Egypt. That's the English explanation of, sometimes these English sentences are like 10 words long for 2 words in Hebrew. Ve'af al gav, even so, dichtiv bahen barishonot, even though it did mention briefly, when it mentioned, I'm the Lord your God, it said, Asher hotzeticha me'eretz Mitzrayim, I took you out of Egypt. But it didn't mention it in a negative way against the Israelites. It mentioned it as a kavod, that God's relationship with us, God took us out of Egypt. Alternatively, davar acher, so in the English now I'm at an alternate interpretation, a few lines from the bottom there. An alternate interpretation. Sorry, I think you have to switch the page. The pages are so printed so largely.
Oh, yes, yeah.
Yeah. An alternate interpretation. If God redeemed us from slavery and intolerable conditions and gave us the Sabbath as a reminder, to remind us that we got out of Egypt, to remind us to treat our slaves well, our own slaves are certainly to be granted no less by us. I think he's saying we also should abolish slavery. We should also let our slaves go. He's saying this in the 13th century. He might be saying that.
But they still had slaves.
They still had slaves, of course. Everyone had
200
slaves
years
around the
ago.
world. It was totally normal.
Mhm.
Do you think it's possible that he's going one step further? The first part was treat your slaves well, because we weren't treated well. The second part is saying, God took us out of slavery, so our slaves deserve the same thing. It would be radical. By the way, it's really interesting if you read some sermons of rabbis in America during that Civil War era, or just before, when slavery was a hotly contentious topic. There were rabbis giving sermons saying slavery is right. And I can prove that because there is slavery in the Torah, not slavery from Egypt. I mean, there's lots of laws around owning your slave and how to treat your slave well. So they were saying slavery is okay. Until now, we don't say that. We don't say that.
No, but he omitted the fact that we were slaves.
Right. We were slaves and we got out. So those slaves should get out too. All right.
Still going on.
Pause and just, I'm looking at our Zoom room. I'm looking at our in-person room.
Chat. Realized you're Claire.
You just realized that's Claire? You see, even if you're in the physical room, we can't always see your
Kept looking
face
at her-
if you're
her
wearing a mask.
I said,
David,
"I
did
know
you want to
that
say
person."
something? Oh, I just saw you lean forward. Okay. You see, I'm watching you. I'm watching you on your Zoom. All right, I'm gonna actually turn away from my Zoom. In my count, that was already insight number 6, 7, insight number 7. Insight number 7. Okay, next one. So we've done, we're gonna move on to the other tablet, the other of the 5. The first 5 are related to man and God. We're going to get back to this later. The second 5 have to do really between man and fellow man. So the first, I'm getting ahead of myself. Yes, that was what I was going to say. Okay, so hang on to that. Hang on to that. Claire is keeping track. But we're moving on to you shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal. Lo tirtzach, lo tinaf, lo tignov. So just a really interesting note. This is the text on my handout, text number 8, which is the Rashi there. So you shall not steal. You shall not steal. When it says that in the 10 Commandments, it's referring to stealing people. It's referring to kidnapping. We also shouldn't steal objects. That is elsewhere in the Torah. This is like lying or swearing under oath, right? Those are 2 different things. So look, I underlined a very short beginning of the Rashi there. Lo tignov, you shall not steal. Scripture here is speaking about a case of one who steals human being. In Hebrew, it's begonev nefashot, stealing human beings. And by the way, he's going to use this opportunity to show us, lo tignovu, another place in the book of Leviticus, where it says, don't steal, that has to do with stealing money, gonev mamon. But he's going to challenge this and say, is this so? Just skip down to where it says, I'm going to paraphrase this instead of reading it inside. His argument is, look at this list: murder, adultery, these are extreme sins. We're not putting stealing objects in the same category of these sins. He says these are sins for which we would offer capital punishment, the death penalty, which they never ended up doing or rarely ended up doing. But these are higher level sins. So it has to be kidnapping here that we're talking about. It's not stealing someone's iPad. It's not up there with murder. Okay, so that's his line of argument. And it comes from the Midrash. Rashi never makes, I shouldn't say never, Rashi rarely makes up his own ideas. Although we love Rashi, he had, a huge impact on Torah learning. Rashi is taking Midrash and taking the ideas from the Midrash, making it a one-liner accessible to all of us. So that's the insight on you shall not steal. You shall not steal people. The last text we're going to look at has at least 3 insights in it. So that's how I'm getting us to 10. I don't know if
On
anyone
the
else is keeping
steal
count. Yes.
business, I just didn't find it. But what does the Pshat say?
Lo tignov.
And it is not limited.
So the word you shall not steal is not specified in any way. It's not specified steal what.
Exactly.
And in even that Rashi that I just read, he said this lo tignov means don't kidnap. And the other lo tignovu is you shall not steal money. It's the same word. It
Yeah, so the
doesn't
point
qualify
that
it. He's understanding it in context of, do you understand what I'm
but
saying?
I haven't heard this explanation before. I always thought primarily of stealing objects, because when we talk about kidnapping, we don't use the word steal.
Right,
Certainly not in modern Hebrew.
right. But it seems in ancient Hebrew, it would be the same word. It sounds strange. It sounds especially if for so many decades you thought it said you shall not steal objects.
For
And but Rashi is asking that. Rashi is saying, he said in there, you can read it on your own. He says, well, how do you know maybe this one is referring to stealing money? And another one is referring to kidnapping people. But he says, no, look at the other sins. Look at, do not murder. This is about people. Do not commit adultery. This is about people. This is all about people, this whole row of sins. So he says, this you shall not steal is about stealing people, is about kidnapping.
It makes sense.
It makes perfect sense once you think about it, once you see it that way.
I never thought of it that way.
The other way, yeah.
Right. So, I mean, everywhere we're printing these commandments, we shouldn't say you shall not steal. It's misleading. We say you shall not kidnap. But remember the Hebrew is ambiguous. The Hebrew doesn't tell you what you shouldn't steal. The Hebrew says you shouldn't steal. That's what we write.
Just anything, don't take anything that is not yours.
Yes, exactly. It doesn't say that either, but it's implied. You should not steal something that isn't yours from someone else. Yeah. By the way, another insight, the last commandment, you shall not covet, is a subject of debate because it's an emotion. How can you command me not to feel jealous? And the Ramban, I believe it is, says, you shall not covet is a commandment that leads to stealing. He wouldn't agree with Rashi here. He would say it's stealing objects. But he says the only time you're really liable for you shall not covet is when it then leads to an action. So once you are jealous of the item and then you steal the item, you've violated two commandments. But he says you're not liable for just the feeling of jealousy. It's only jealousy that leads to stealing.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I have a question. Many legal systems around the world are based on Judaism and the Ten Commandments. Now, when someone steals $500 million from somebody else, they go to jail if they prove it.
Right.
That takes time.
Yeah. Yeah.
But they'll go to jail, but not forever, like they will if they kill the owner. That means stealing a man,
Yeah.
according to this,
Yeah.
so that they're on two different levels, really, stealing a man and stealing things.
Absolutely. I mean, we're not getting into kind of punishments for these crimes.
No, but I'm just
But-
comparing.
Yeah. Yeah.
I never thought
Yeah,
of
of course,
the
that's
thou
true.
shalt not steal as a,
Theft. It's
in
theft.
this way
We call
before.
it theft,
Yeah.
robbery.
well, you're stealing a person's life if you kidnap and hurt them.
Absolutely.
And that's much more valuable, in my mind, I
Yeah.
guess, than the $500 million, even though it's quite a valuable thing.
I'm just mindful of the time, so we're going to read this last text now together. This has several of the commandments are referenced here. So this is what we're going to end on. This is the Ramban Nahmanides. So now we've gone from France into Spain. We've moved ahead another 100 years, 14th century. So he lists a whole bunch, right? You should not murder, you should not commit adultery, you should not steal. By the way, that's how it's translated. You should not steal. We're not wrong. It's just, it's up for the debate what we're stealing. Okay. What I find interesting, this is a rather long text, so I'm just going to move through it in English. And we'll pause at the end to absorb the different components. So Ramban is saying, God is saying, now I have commanded you to acknowledge in thought and in deed that I am the creator of all. So I am, what he's doing right now is he's summarizing the 10 commandments. He's summarizing the 10 commandments by saying, God is telling us, believe in me, and that I'm the creator, and to honor parents because they joined me in your formation. You see what he just did? He kind of went through from the first couple of commandments right to honoring your parents. And if so, guard against destroying the work of my hands and spilling the blood of man. He went there into murder, whom I have created to honor me and acknowledge me in all these matters. And now he's going into adultery. Do not commit adultery with your fellow man's wife. because this is a strange reason. Okay. Why shouldn't you commit adultery? Because you will thereby destroy the principle of honoring parents, causing the children to deny the truth and acknowledge falsehood. They will not know their fathers. In other words, they won't know that you slept with your neighbor's wife and you're really the father. And thus they'll give their honor to another. They're going to miss out on the proper honor your father. Weird. Okay. We're not going to pause on this, but they're going to give their honor to another, to not their father, just as idol worshipers do, who say to a block of wood, "You are my father." Okay, that's a quote. And they don't know their father who created them. Okay, now he's moving forward to other commandments. He talked about adultery in a strange way. After that, we have to come back to that someday. After that, God warned us against stealing a human being. There it is. For that too brings about a similar disintegration of values. And then with respect to their stringency and penalties, the order of the commandment is as follows. After idolatry comes bloodshed. After that, adultery. Then stealing a human being. Then false testimony and robbery. And he who does not covet will never harm his neighbor. He was trying to suggest some significance in the order there. Maybe an order of severity. Okay, I'm going to skip forward. So what he's done is he's made all of the 10 commandments an outgrowth of the first one. They're all about God and honoring God. Rabbi Abraham Ibn Ezra wrote about the last one. Now I skipped a lot of this Ramban and I'm jumping right to here. And this is another noticing of order. The commandment says, "You shall not covet your neighbor's house, your neighbor's wife, nor his servant," etc. So the Ibn Ezra says, he was also in Spain, so he's quoting an earlier Spanish commentator, that scripture adopted a normal course of life. First, it mentioned the neighbor's house. Don't covet a house, because first you have to have a house. For an enlightened person will first acquire a house and then marry a woman to bring her to his house. So you're not going to get married unless you have somewhere to live. That's how it went. You can't, if you don't have your own place, you're not going to start, finding a match. And only afterwards will he acquire then staff, right? A manservant, maidservant. But in the book of Deuteronomy, the second version of the 10 Commandments, it mentions the wife first. Because young men desire to marry first. They're doing it backwards, Nebuch. These young people, they're dating, they're marrying, they're still living at home. So it may be that because of coveting the neighbor's wife is the greatest sin of all things mentioned in that verse, like that's the worst, then maybe that's why it's listed first. And then a final insight. Thus, this is what we were talking about before, Claire, about the honoring your parents being on the wrong side. Of the 10 commandments, there are 5 which refer to the glory of the Creator. That's the first 5. And 5 are for the welfare of man. In Hebrew, we say ben adam lamakom, ben adam lachavero, the commandments that are between me and God, as opposed to the commandments that are between me and other people, the ones that go this way or that way. But honor your parents. What number is that one? 5. It's on the side having to do with God, right? Believe in God, idol worship, taking God's name in vain, keeping Shabbat. The 5th one has to do with God, but it has to do with human beings. So honoring your parents is for the glory of God, since it is for the glory of the Creator that God commanded that one honor one's parent, who is a partner in the formation of the child. This is a reference to the teaching that there are 3 partners in creating a human being: the mother, the father, and God. It doesn't acknowledge adoptive parents. It doesn't acknowledge, lots of other people, teachers and guides. But in terms of the physical creation of a human being, it's understood that there's the father, the mother, and then God giving the soul. So those first 5 all have to do with God. And why do we honor parents? Because we recognize their creative powers. They brought you into this world physically. And then the other 5 have to do with the ben adam lachavero, between man and fellow man.
Very interesting.
It's a long Ramban, but I couldn't cut more than I already cut. So it was masterful, this last piece. That's why I wanted to end on this. He pulled together all 10, and then he summarized the 2 sides, the first half and the second half, and he put them all in the context of the obligations that we feel toward God and toward other human beings. As we're closing, I'm wondering if we can go around, if anyone wants to share. I know it's helpful when we learn something. It's helpful to consolidate it by sharing one point that was new today that you're still thinking about. So I don't want to put everyone on the spot, but if anyone wants to volunteer and give a 30-second, yes, Philip, what's one point that we discussed today that you're walking away in your pocket?
First
Pondering.
of all, there's more than one point, so thank you very much.
Thank you.
But the last point, I disagree with on the first bounce, but we haven't, of course, had a chance. To
We
talk
haven't
about
taken it apart.
And what I'm saying is all of the 10 commandments are for man, in
Oh,
my view.
wow.
All the first 5 and the last 5 are for
How
man.
so? How so?
Because that's what permits a society to function. It takes all of it.
Even godliness, even believing in some higher power?
But we discussed, I don't believe that the belief is
That's-
central to Judaism anyway.
Yeah, okay.
So it's all a formula for how you should live your life.
I remember the first time I studied Durkheim. This is the sociology of religion courses that I took in college. And Durkheim talks about God as the idea of the sacred around which societies organize. So if there is a sacred, then societies work better. An idea of a common sacred. You could call it God, you could call it a common purpose. You could, unfortunately, when we're so divided, we don't agree on what is sacred. That's when we're all discordant with one another. But thank you. Another concept that anyone can share that you're walking away with.
Maybe something for me.
Please.
I've been wondering since the beginning, if we didn't have the 10 declarations, would we know intuitively how to treat other people?
It's a great debate.
question.
Whether those mitzvot ben adam lachavero, the commandments between man and fellow man, whether those are intuitive.
Yes.
This is a subject of great debate, and some will say yes and some will say no. The ones who say yes, this is intuitive, because that's the ones who say no. This is not just a Jewish debate, but a debate amongst philosophers. Is it like a dog-eat-dog world out there? We're all out for ourselves, or do we have an intrinsic sense of generosity? So the ones who say it's a dog-eat-dog world, this is Hobbes and all those early thinkers around. I'm thinking of Lord of the Flies that we had to read in high school. Did they have that in French here as well, or you read it in English? It's the one with those boys on an island and they all end up killing each other. And that's the idea that if we don't have laws, we basically eat each other alive. So of course we need these laws in the Torah. We would destroy each other otherwise. But if you say it's intuitive, then what the Torah is bringing us to do is to think of a different motivation for it. I could be kind to you out of my own intuition that this is good for society. But if I'm doing it because God commanded me, how does that change it? I'm doing it because I acknowledge godliness in you. I'm doing it because I acknowledge God as the source of creation. Any other motivation? So to your point, it could still end up with the same result, but the motives might be different.
Interesting.
Yeah. Please, Naomi and then Esther, and then we'll turn to the Zoom.
Well,
room.
I think it would be ideal if that was the case, then the world wouldn't be in the mess it is today.
Right. So
I mean,
you're in the
come on.
first camp saying, come on, look around. I mean, look at Ukraine.
And whose
Look at-
God says what somebody else's God tells you, I mean,
Yeah,
it's.
it's fair.
So
I
you
mean,
think
that's
we
an
need,
idea.
you think we need to know? We need to hear them?
You think that we need those laws in order to,
Oh,
Yeah, if
yes.
everybody,
Treat
that would
kindly,
be
yeah.
ideal, we'd have a better world, of course.
yeah,
I think there's a spectrum from very, very good to very, very bad in the whole world. There are people who would be kind and nice. And that's also, I think, based on a lot of their background, their genetics and so on. And similarly, at the other end, it might not be so good because of their background and
Right.
experiences and so on. I think that having rules truly is important and helpful.
mhm,
Not everybody follows them.
right.
So you're gonna
Then
have
you need
bad,
consequences and you
you're
need.
always
criminal-
gonna have both.
Yeah.
We're human beings.
I'm just realizing, I'm so carried away in this conversation, but there was somewhere else I was supposed to go to another meeting at 12, which I've now totally blown off. This is this is so refreshing. Now I know that we have to have longer classes when we're in person because the conversation flows. And I want to acknowledge everyone who's joined us on Zoom as well. I'm not going to be able to turn to the Zoom room again because of the constraints of time. But what I do want to remind you of is that Shavuot is coming. And on Saturday night, we'll have a very late night dinner and then learning all the way until midnight. We're not going all night as we usually do. We're coming back after pandemic. So please join us not only on Shabbat morning, but also on Saturday night and Sunday and Monday. And, you know, maybe as we're listening to the 10 Commandments being read in synagogue this holiday, maybe it'll sound a little bit different. I hope so. Certainly will do for me. Thank you, everyone, for joining on the Zoom. Thank you.
Thank you.